On December 26, 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR acknowledged the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS, by 11 of the 15 former Soviet republics. It recognized that, as a result, the Soviet Union no longer existed as a state or as a subject of international law. This declaration officially marked the end of the Soviet Union. Founded on December 30th, 1922, the Soviet Union finally collapsed on December 26, 1991, 4 days before the founding's 69th anniversary. As the Soviet Union collapsed, the countries independently of the Soviet Union appeared in the international community. As the Soviet Union was dismantled, the communist forces ended, and the Cold War era, which was ideologically opposed by capitalism and communist forces in the late 20th century, was officially completely ended with the victory of capitalist forces. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became General Secretary in March 1985, introduced perestroika, restructuring, to address the ongoing economic decline and stagnation that had affected the Eastern Bloc since the 1970s. Alongside economic reforms, he implemented political reforms and later assumed the newly created position of President of the Soviet Union. These reforms created a window of opportunity for significant change within the Soviet system. In July 1989, and more prominently by March 1990, the three Baltic republics, starting with the Lithuanian SSR, began demanding independence and formally declared it. In response to the growing calls for separation, Gorbachev held a referendum in March 1991 to determine the future of the Union. The majority of participants voted in favor of preserving a renewed federation, showing support for maintaining the Soviet Union in some form. However, this was defeated in August, and Boris Yeltsin, who later took the Soviet power, tried to take control of the Soviet Union, but Ukraine agreed to withdraw from the Soviet Union on December 1, 1991, with the overwhelming rates of 90% in the Ukrainian independence referendum on December 1, 1991. Yeltsin gave up his attempt to suppress Ukraine, signed a Bela Vega Treaty, confirmed that the Soviet Union did not survive, and withdrew from Ukraine, and the last member, Kazakhstan, withdraws, and the Soviet Union resigned. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was slowly entering the recession due to the burden of arms for military competition, economic downturn due to the inefficiency of the planned economy, and the demand for democratization in Eastern Europe. Immediately after the death of Leonid Brezhnev, the secretary of the Soviet Communist Party in 1982, the Soviet Communist Party was elected as the secretary of Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Karnenko, then the elders at the time. But both Andropov and Chernenko died for less than 2 years. After 3 years of death during the 3 years from 1982 to 1985, the Soviet Communist Party was long-term in the long term, and at the same time, public opinion that wanted leaders to overcome the internal problems of the Soviet Union at the same time. At that time, the political officers paid attention to the political sector Mikhail Gorbachev, who had received positive reputation while working as an aide in Yuri Andropov. At the time, Gorbachev was a relatively young age, 50, in the political bureau, which was noted for this, elected Mikhail Gorbachev as a new secretary to lead the Soviet Union after Chernenko. On March 10, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected as secretary. Gorbachev considered political and economic reform to escape the stagnation of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev has announced political and economic reform policies, perestroika and glasnost policy to reform the Soviet Union. Gorbachev tried to reduce the political, economic, and military burden on the Soviet Union at the time and to drive the Soviet Union democratically in the long run, and to drive the Soviet Union. The perestroika and glasnost, promoted by Gorbachev, became the cornerstone of finishing the Cold War, receiving positive evaluation from the Soviets and the international community. At the time, perestroika was welcomed by the Soviet Union, but at the same time, it was an opportunity to extract political intentions that the Soviets had not been expressed for a long time. At that time, the Soviets demanded political intentions that have been suppressed, such as the withdrawal of the Soviet troops, the Communist Party's daily system reform, the guarantee of local autonomy, and the elimination of censorship, and the Soviet Union failed to deal with explosive political changes and requests for reform. At the time, the Soviet Communist Party began to conflict with the radical wave that supports radical reforms than Gorbachev, moderate reforms that should be carried out more moderate. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union increased its economic burden due to military bleeding caused by military competition, repairing costs due to the explosion of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, planning economic system paralysis caused by political confrontation between the central government and the Federal Republic, and reduced tax revenues due to low oil prices. As a result, the Soviet government has caused great disruptions to the economic driving force that leads to reform. With the deterioration of the Soviet economy, the Soviet Union felt the burden of maintaining the Soviet-centered system represented by Brezhnev doctrine politically and military during the Cold War. At that time, the Soviet Union announced a Sinatra doctrine that would no longer intervene in Eastern European socialist countries where democratization demanded. This led to the Eastern European Revolution, and Eastern European socialist states accepted the demand for democratization one by one. The peak of this political democratization was the collapse of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. After the Berlin Barrier collapsed, the Soviet Union concluded that it was difficult to maintain a communist camp in Eastern Europe. After the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union dismantled the Warsaw Treaty Organization and MAMEN, and try to overcome the difficulties through active cooperation and economic support with Western countries, not as a lord of the communist camp. However, the conservatives in the Communist Party resisted that Gorbachev's reform measures collapsed the existing Soviet system, and the radicals decided that the existing reform was weak and ordered Gorbachev a stronger reform. Gorbachev initially mobilized Soviet troops to strongly suppress the Baltic Triple Independence movement, or mobilize the military in Tbilisi and Baku to block independent movements and appease conservatives. Rather, the hard-line suppression, which mobilized the military, was a chance to rebellion in many republics. Despite the conflict between the reform and conservatives, Gorbachev tried to maintain the Soviet Union by establishing the relationship between the central government and the Federal Republic. In 1991, it was the Soviet vote and the National Federation of Sovereignty. Gorbachev confirmed the intentions of the Soviets who wanted to maintain the Soviet Union at the time, and at the same time promised a newly laid base system that gave more authority to the Republic of the Federal Republic. In response, the Federal Republic leaders discussed with Gorbachev for a long time and prepared to reorganize the new soft system. Thanks to this effort, it can lead to a newly led treaty with 3 Baltic countries, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova. After the agreement, the leaders took a break and decided to sign the newly led treaty on August 20th, 1991. If the major executives in the Soviet Union, KGB, and the Soviet Communist Party had not decided to cause a coup on August 19th, the day before the signature, Gorbachev's efforts could have been achieved. A coup of hard-liners in 1991. After this coup, the situation will change significantly as follows. In order not to collapse the Soviet Union, a new treaty had been made or the coup had to succeed. However, amidst the last chance of the Soviet federal system, which could not have failed, Gorbachev tried to form a new relationship between the Central Agency and the Republic of the Federation to maintain the Soviet Union together. Until 1990 to 1991, negotiations for this purpose were carried out for a long time and faced difficulties, but the talks were on the verge of achieving results. However, on the day before the signature of the Central Republic, the KGB, Army, military complex, and the Soviet Communist Party's hardliners decided to bring about a coup on August 19th. In August, conspirators in the coup argued that the Federal Treaty would drive the Soviet Union into chaos and anarchies, and said the state is acting to prevent the state from greeting tragic fate. The coup did not suddenly happen. It was already a sign of the following. In December 1990, Shevardnadze resigned suddenly and warned of the imminent hard-liners. In January 1991, violent oppression occurred in Lithuania and Latvia. In June 1991, a constitutional coup attempt was attempted. And in July, various Soviets and Congresses were declared by the very strong Gorbachev character. But the limit of this coup was that it was not a coup for the purpose of attacking Gorbachev. Gorbachev rejected a coup, and the coup failed. The failure of the coup predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union 4 months later. The extensive results of the failed coup were especially important in the end of the Soviet Union. One of the most important things was the decisive change of Ukraine. Scholars or government analysts who had pored over various sorts of data before March 1985 to try to gauge whether fundamental change was about to happen would have seen that the Soviet Union was facing daunting challenges, but they would not have found anything in the data to suggest that the Soviet Union was in a system-threatening crisis. Before March 1985, no credible scholar would have predicted that the Soviet Union would cease to exist by the end of 1991. In that sense, we cannot point to longer-term precursor signals of the Soviet collapse. The Soviet Union, as of March 1985, was not approaching a catastrophic bifurcation. The contextual tipping point for the Soviet Union came only when Gorbachev dealt a rapid series of destabilizing shocks to the system that by 1991 left it vulnerable to fragmentation. The direct tipping points then came with the abortive August 1991 coup and the independence referendum in Ukraine, which in combination caused the Union to unravel. When he could not stop the trend, Gorbachev resigned on December 25th, and the next day, the Soviet Union's top meeting was approved by the 142 in declaration. As a result, the Soviet Socialist Republic, the world's first socialist state, founded on December 30th, 1922, was dismantled in 26 days and 11 months. Thank you for watching.